What's up, Vibe Tribe? Man, it feels like it's been a while since I was actually live and direct. And we got the great Mario Garza joining tonight. Basically, my entire strategy this year is kind of shifting, where it became apparent sometime around January that it's really important for me to switch to a quality over quantity mentality in life in general, but, in particular towards content. And that means not as many Vibrants have been made since the beginning of the year. Although that's going to change. I've got basically a full Wednesday lineup every week in February, which is awesome. That may or may not be the case going forward every week, but suffice to say, we're not going to be doing any, last minute thrown together by the seat of my pants streams anymore. As fun as those may be, they're not really worth it to my peace of mind. And I enjoy more spending the extra time on research if I don't have something thoroughly prepared. And it's been, I think, really bringing the quality up of the main show InnerVerse, which I've got some excellent stuff in the shoot ready to come out soon and some really exciting interviews on the horizon. And ultimately, this idea of quality over quantity, it permeates everything about our modern age, the inverse of that, I should say. And the more that I contemplate this idea, the more improvements I'm seeing in my life and in myself, both subtly and in kind of some big steps and jumps that I didn't necessarily even expect. So very excited. And I hit Mario up. I wanted to get some Vibrants on the schedule. And, it's been a while since we talked to him, and I asked, what topic would you select? And wouldn't you figure he actually brought up this very idea, quality over quantity, and especially through the excellent writing of the occultimate esoteric hipster René Guénon in his book, The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times, which I managed to get through reading all of it. And there's a lot to say. It's quite a dense tome, and I'm really stoked to talk to Mario about it. How you doing, man? Welcome to the show.
I'm great, man. I'm impressed that you got through all of it. I don't know if you started recently when I sent you the copies or not, but that's pretty impressive. And yeah, you absolutely inspired this topic. I had been reading through the book. It took me a little while to go through it, and I got a lot out of it. And there's so much to talk about with it, right? It is very dense. A lot of people consider this to be his magnum opus. And when I was watching your show, and as I've overheard Michelle listening to the show too, I heard you mention a few times recently quality over quantity, and my ears really did perk up. And I'm like, that's right, exactly. And there's a few other people that I'm connected with online who've kind of been echoing the same sentiments. And I'm like, well, I mean, this whole entire book is really just an examination of this dynamic of quality over quantity or quality versus quantity. The whole idea that basically, things that are qualitative in nature and relate to essence or spirit really is falling by the wayside. And essentially that there's been a descent of sorts towards quantity, pure quantity. And I think you can really see that in the modern world with how people seemingly perceive everything. So I'm excited to talk to you. I've got a bunch of different notes, and, I don't think we're really going to be able to, completely unpack this thing in one episode. We'll be scratching the surface. But since it's a fresh read for you, man, that's awesome. I haven't talked to anyone else who's read it yet.
Oh, sweet. Okay, I'm going to be completely honest. There were a few chapters in the latter half that I skimmed. And if I was to give a critique to Guenon, why I called him the esoteric hipster is because he does a really great job breaking down what defines the Kali Yuga in this particular analysis of the polarity between quality and quantity in such a way that I actually came out of it convinced of the idea of the Kali Yuga in a way that I'd never been before. I'm kind of by default skeptical of cycles of time in the way that it's presented by mythology and priestcraft, because one thing I've noticed they're consistently wrong about is cycles of time. They're always changing their mind and all that. And without having necessarily an idea of like the length of time or when a cycle begins or ends, the defining attributes of the Iron Age or the Kali Yuga, as put forward by Guenon, are solid, really solid, to the point where there's stuff that he talks about in here, from his perspective in the 40s, that have come to pass as if he was a prophet. And he talks about prophecy being just like, being aware of the cycle. And it seems that he had some awareness of the cycle. Now, the chapters I skimmed had to do with him basically taking a big old dump on every other occult practice or psychological magical practice that existed in his time with, and unfortunately those aspects of the book, it's just kind of a lot of superiority dissing of other methods, with a lot of like, it's dangerous, you'll be influenced by lower forces, but not really explaining how you'd be influenced or how to protect yourself from it, or what a better practice would be in terms of psychosomatic healing, or indigenous magical traditions and whatnot. So that part of the book I'm not so into. We don't have to really go there so much because it just was a lot of negation without any solution. But the pattern recognition of the attributes of this quantitative culture are off the charts accurate. Really, really amazing.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. He's given me a lot to think about. And a few of the chapters too, I definitely want to specifically get into if we have time. But I think a great sort of way to kick things off is I sent you a link on Telegram. Not sure if you got it, but there's a PDF there. I put together some slides, and there's a couple of slides that I think really encapsulate sort of what this whole entire conversation is about. And so I'm just thinking about slide 2 and slide 3 whenever you have that ready. And I'll say too that, just in case people aren't aware, I really got through Guenon through symbolism. And so I noticed that a lot of my symbolic dictionaries that I really gravitated towards would reference him quite a bit. And there's one in particular that I'm thinking of where he's the most quoted author. And so it took me years to finally come around to wanting to read his work. And then once I started, I realized that he really is, basically someone that I look up towards highly. And I think that he knows a lot when it comes to symbolism. And I found that, his other works were worth diving into. So I had no idea all of the different things that he really talked about with metaphysics and whatnot. So it's been an interesting journey. And, at least right now, I have no reason to stop reading his work personally, just because I get so much out of it, and there's always something for me to kind of chew on and all of that.
Yeah, I would just wonder where he attained his initiatory wisdom through, or whatnot. That's kind of not disclosed by Guenon. I found it also interesting timing to be going through this particular book, because on the other side of my research, I've been preparing and have just recorded a show talking about the Hermetic Renaissance of around the same time period that Guenon was contemporary in Italy. And on there's a lot of interesting writings out of those guys, and a lot that just seems like total word salad and nonsense. To be honest, someone that looks at this stuff a lot, which is not out of place for alchemical literature in general. But I look at a lot of these Hermetic practitioners of his era, and many of their lives are kind of just train wrecks. And I don't know about Guenon's life, so I can't comment on his in particular, but it makes a lot of his criticisms of other occultism seem valid when you compare and contrast people's lives that were doing some of the stuff that he has negative things to say about.
Right. So maybe just leave it right here with the book cover, right? And so for all intents and purposes, you can view this image here as a wheel, right? And I think the wheel is a really good symbol to sort of unpack and help us discuss this whole entire dynamic. The idea from his perspective is that there was a tradition, which he refers to as the primordial tradition, that preceded all other traditions, and that all traditions since then are basically echoes or remnants of that tradition. And that if you understand the symbolism, you know that it goes back to this earliest tradition, right? And of, supreme importance to this early tradition was this idea of a sacred center, principle unity, right? Non-duality, and that everything is expressed from the center returns back to the center, right? So with the wheel, the hub of the wheel would be the center of the wheel. This is where the reconciliation of opposites occurs. This is where non-duality is. The external part of the wheel is related to multiplicity. It's related to division. And so if mankind has gone through something of a fall or of a descent, we're moving further away from this principal unity. We're moving further away from essence or quality. And as that occurs, what ends up happening is that a quantitative sort of reality kind of unfolds and people start seeing everything quantitatively. And so this makes all the sense in the world. It's like moving away from that sacred center towards, the rim of the wheel, if you will, right? And symbolically, too, he says that the external part of the wheel is more so related to earth, things outside of self, etc. That's how I perceive it. And the inner portion of the wheel, that hub of the wheel, is more so related to heaven. It's the transcendental point of the whole entire system, right? But if you go to the next slide, you'll see that basically I went through the book and I looked at the different ways in which he explains quality versus quantity, right? So, and I'd love to get your feedback on this. And so quality, right? Essence versus substance, principal unity versus multiplicity on the quantitative side, form versus matter. He refers to quality as being intelligible, quantity as being sensible, quality as being the essential pole versus the substantial pole, quality being related to heaven or the celestial way, and then quantity relating more to earth, materialism, and the infernal way. So this is what he, just scanning the book, looking through my highlights and stuff, this is how he juxtaposes these two things, quality versus quantity. And, the book, The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times, it really is all around you. It's ever since I finished this book, all of the things that I've been perceiving in media and just how people speak and just their perception of everything. It's so amazing how much all of it is completely based in quantity. And so it really has been this has been a very transformative book for me, at least. And I'm still going through this transformation. There's still things that I'm like processing and things like that. But just like what you said with the pattern recognition, I think he's on the money with this. And so he says towards the end of a cycle, the end of a great age, potentially the end of the Kali Yuga, this dark age, that quantitative sort of reasoning and that perception just completely goes through the roof. And what he does say is that towards the end of an age, there is like a quickening that does happen. And he likens it to something that's falling and picks up speed, essentially, right? So if you roll a wheel down a hill, it's going to pick up speed. If you drop something, it's going to pick up speed. That's what he says happens towards the end of a cycle. So this speeding up dynamic definitely seems to be like a real phenomenon.
Well, and also another interesting part of the metaphor, and I've never heard it described this way before, regarding the squaring of the circle. Mm-hmm. He describes this picking up speed, also basically bending the wheel out of shape until the point that it becomes cubic, and then it reaches a halt. So like the Ouroboros, where the snake is eating its own tail, meaning that the end becomes the beginning rather than going back the other way. This is his way of describing that following the Iron Age is the Golden Age. There's not like a reversal back up the ladder. You come out the bottom to the top, but it requires the world to basically in an instant end and be recreated, which that's a little more abstract. We can, speculate on that as we go, but I find it fascinating that the entire premise is that this quantitative perspective that culture has become inculcated with is the cause of this fall. It itself is the cause. And he also, makes a fair point that this isn't even in itself a bad thing. It's just like a natural rhythm of reality. Mm-hmm. And, there's some inference that we shouldn't necessarily interfere with the process.
Right.
Or that we can't really interfere with the process, but to not fear it, that it's leading us back to something good. And it makes me think of times where I've heard heard descriptions of the evil elites wanting to bring about the end of the world. And it makes you think, well, if there are leaders in possession of the knowledge of the cycle, and time itself is more of a subjective thing than an objective thing, then maybe there's some rationale behind the hastening of the materialistic program to
Mhm.
bring about a golden age more quickly. Now, that's not my attempt to justify evil in the world, but it is an interesting point to consider.
Right. No, I completely agree with you. I think it's interesting too that he references the golden age, and I think it's what is it, slide number 5, I believe. Or maybe there you go. It is that one. The partisans of progress have a habit of saying that the golden age is not the past, but in the future. And I think that's really interesting. And that's basically his whole entire MO is going back to this primordial tradition and the metaphysics of this primordial tradition, this center, the sacred center, this inner sanctum sort of concept with everything, right? And I just thought it was fascinating that he was writing about this because we're hearing more chatter in the media about a new golden age, right? And that the golden age is to come. But yet, if there's sort of no understanding of a previous golden age and what that really represents, they can kind of just say golden age and whatever. That can mean so many different things because most people don't really have an idea of what the last golden age was about. In my opinion, based on his readings, at least, his perspective is that the center and basically a reverence and working with this concept of a center is what defined the golden age, basically, this primordial principle unity. And so he says that in the dark age, it's the center that's lost. I think this is really fascinating too, when you consider that people have said that Saturn was the ruler of the last golden age. And Saturn is all about compression and restriction, right? That's how we kind of tend to know it in astrology and things like that. And so when you compress something so much, where are you going to? You're going to the center, So basically, there's a lot of polar symbolism with Saturn, and so you can make that case all day long that Saturn has this polar sort of dynamic where you're going towards the middle of things. And so I think that is also very interesting as well when you consider that Aquarius was once ruled by Saturn. And there's all of this talk about the age of Aquarius. And I recently put out a post and I asked people, are we in the age of Aquarius? Are we transitioning? When is it coming? All that kind of stuff. Wildly different answers. But in a way, do you see this, that the age of Aquarius is almost kind of an overlay, almost like a code for the golden age, that basically in modern terms, when people refer to the age of Aquarius, they're essentially referring to a golden age. And so again, is it a return to the Saturnian sort of idea, this more polar dynamic? I also have to bring up the fact that Aquarius rules the star card. And in my opinion, it's the star of stars. It's the pole star, right? So is it a return of the polar age? Kind of not unlike what Guenon puts out there.
That's I'll just say I am not qualified, nor am I convinced that the cycles as described by whether yugas or processional ages are well enough defined to be sensible. But it does seem that people treat the idea of the age of Aquarius or the new age as the oncoming golden age. Absolutely. And there's a really fascinating part of the symbolism of quantity and quantity as it pertains to space and time in Guénon's writing, that time is the compressive force
Yes.
and space is the expanding force. And, I'm getting kind of ahead of us, but or where we're at, but the aspect of the shift, you could say, where the wheel comes to a stop, where the circle becomes a square and it can no longer roll and everything halts and reboots, the Great Reset, has to do with basically space or time has compressed space down. The world's getting smaller. Smaller. There's less potential. There's less unknown. And then all of a sudden there's a flip where all of a sudden space conquers time and time pauses more or less. And then that's the moment of the return of the primordial state, where everything in all potentiation exists in a singularity or an eternal moment. Man recognizes his eternality. The flow of time, essentially, as it is a completely mental construct, like everything else in the reality being mental, is halted, and we more or less have a realization.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting about this is there's a paradox there around the individual and the collective, and like the positive individuation of basically being, you know, the big C consciousness, cosmic consciousness, versus the individuation of modernity as it's presented. And I really want to make sure that we talk some about that. So, you know, there's the science elements, or what passes for science, that we really want to unpack, and how the reign of quantity, it deludes those sciences. In particular, he says it is precisely in the reign of quantity that here it is. The pretended sciences, by leaving aside or even intentionally eliminating all that is truly essential, clearly prove themselves incapable of furnishing the explanation of anything whatsoever. And I think that, you know, to really understand what he's talking about with essential versus quantitative, the idea of materialism is that that matter is inert or dead, and that it has no intrinsic quality to it. And to bring everything back down to like the really original aspect of this dichotomy, we need to remember that numbers, as the abstract quantitative idea that they're used most commonly in society to be, they do not actually exist. The quantitative is the illusory, which is why, as it becomes more and more prominent as the lens through which people see reality, people become more and more divorced from the truth.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's no such thing as like 5 in nature in a quantitative sense, but in the Pythagorean idea of the qualities of number, those essences that are described by the integers, then there's something real. And, you know, that's what he means by essential, is the non-corporeal elements, the qualia of things, the, you know, not necessarily in a sensory way, but in a symbolic way,
Mm-hmm.
you could
Right.
say.
Right. Yep. Exactly. I just have to point out, I think it's so interesting. You brought up the time dynamic and compression, and then it just makes me think of Saturn again and Chronos, right? And how Saturnian symbolism really plays a major part in what's happening in winter. I'm thinking of Capricorn being ruled by Saturn, basically. I'm thinking of the fact that, you know, based on the Gregorian calendar and everything else, like the new year takes place during this time of year. And then, of course, like I said earlier, Aquarius once being ruled by Saturn. And so, so to me, there's just like so many things kind of just going on with just that simple correspondence, right? That I think is really intriguing. Right.
We should also add too that, you know, you brought up the winter symbolism, and in the microcosm, or the macrocosm, you could say the West is the winter aspect because it's the sunset. So it's the going into the nighttime part of the cycle. And in the reign of quantity, it is then and only then, according to Guenon, that the opinion of the majority can claim to be taken into consideration at all. And so this democratic idea and the tyranny of the crowd and the collectivization of humanity under the guise of a unity actually imposes a uniformity,
right,
which separates people from their essence. And there's a lot to talk about with this.
Yeah.
Meaning that what, even in the word unit, you know, it should be understood that the idea of a unit refers to the essential unity of all things, the oneness in all things. But our usage of the word unit is referring to individuated separate integers. And so people have mistaken in this age, unity has been mistaken, or uniformity has been mistaken for unity, essentially. And we really need to talk about that. So we'll try to get to all these things, but this is, I think, a pretty solid introduction, other than to say that this democratic, collectivization, quantitative, census obsessed, statistically obsessed, materialist reality, it does seem to originate from the West. And he says that's a very significant correspondence in terms of where we're at in the end of a cycle, that the domination of the West is akin to the setting of the sun, that refers to the end of a cycle. And I think that makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah, no, exactly right. No, I think that makes a lot of sense too. It's so interesting too. I think of manifest destiny and this idea of going westward, and just the fact that people, while supposedly from Europe, came to the Americas to settle it. They settled the East Coast. Eventually, people from the East went further west and everything else. And how the West Coast, literally, of the United States is more progressive than even the East Coast. So it's like the end of the line of the Western world in a lot of ways, right? And so this is where we have San Francisco, the Bay Area, technology, Hollywood, all of these different things, right? It's the Golden State. And so there was all this propaganda essentially encouraging people to continue going westward, continuing this sort of progressive kind of ideology and everything else. Regarding sort of the uniformity, he has a chapter called Uniformity Against Unity, right? And one of the things I took away from the book that I think is really interesting to think about is the role of the artist or the artisan, and how back in the day it was considered to be like kind of your birthright in a way, like what you were destined to do. Were you supposed to be a baker or a farmer or a potter, or like what were you doing in the world? If you did not fulfill sort of that role or that duty, then that was considered to be very chaotic, right? So if you were supposed to be a shaman, if you were supposed to be a healer, if you were supposed to be any number of things, that this is what your sort of life's mission was really truly all about. And the idea of the artist back in the day creating something, we wanted your personality in it. We wanted sort of your character. We wanted your individual sort of nature and your take in your art, whatever it might be, right? And so he says that just over time with industrialization and kind of the mechanized world, that everything has become mass produced, obviously. And as things have become mass produced, the role of the artist has significantly changed. And now everything is very much cookie cutter, right? And so everything is cookie cutter. Everything is the same. Everything as quantity has taken over everything. Everything is about creating and selling as many units, as many widgets as you possibly can. So with that comes this anonymous sort of thing with all of these products that we have around us, right? In a traditional society, everything in your home, I'm assuming you knew exactly where it came from. There wasn't anything that you put in your body. There wasn't anything that you wore. There wasn't anything in your immediate vicinity that was basically anonymously created, right? You had some sense of where these materials came from. We cannot say that about today's world, by and large, for most people, right? Including myself. And so I'm looking at all these things in my office right now. It's like, I have no idea where a lot of this stuff came from, what country it came from, what materials it's composed of, anything like that. So he really spends a bit of time talking about that. And obviously, too, again, industrialization and making money, which is very quantitative, clearly, is an interesting sort of thing that he unpacks as well with the chapter. He calls it, I think, the degeneration of coinage. And he was saying that.
Well, let's pause on the coinage.
Go for
come
it.
Back to that. I want to keep going on the arts and crafts.
Go for it. Yeah.
Because, like we could expand on that greatly. I think it's one of the most significant parts of the whole story. So I'm going to just read a few passages from him about this. He's established throughout the book up to this point that one of the distinctions of the traditional age, of which we have barely even any remnant or echo to speak of, and that what we call antiquity had already forgotten most of what the traditional age would have been about. But one of the aspects of the traditional age was that there was no separation between sacred and profane. And now everything is just pure profane. But the point being that there was a religious significance to every object and every action. And it wasn't something that you thought about. It was just intrinsic. You can almost think of it like the the bifurcation of consciousness that's talked about in psychology, that the theory that at one point humanity's inner dialogue or inner monologue was perceived as the voices of gods rather than this egoistic, like individuated self that it's me talking. And so our inspirations potentially in a previous age would have always felt sacred. Our thoughts would have felt like transmissions from on high or from something bigger. And this idea of the religiosity in a sacred sense, not in like the modern religious sense of our creations and our work, is so lost on us that, like you said, it's all mass produced. I'm going to read a couple of passages from him that really fulfill this idea. According to the traditional conception, each person must normally fulfill the function for which he is destined by his own nature, using the particular aptitudes essentially implicit in that nature as such. So this is where we get, in the Kali Yuga, the creation of castes. And the idea doesn't really fit that well because of the desacralization of so much of what, society has become. And we even look at the idea of castes as a negative concept, while at the same time, we're all striving theoretically to find a vocation rather than an occupation that allows us to express our soul's purpose. But anyway, he's talking about the particular aptitudes essentially implicit in the nature of a person where he must fulfill those, and he goes on to say he cannot fulfill a different function except at the cost of a serious disorder, which will have its repercussions on the whole social organization of which he is a part. And much more than this, if that kind of disorder becomes general, it will begin to have an effect on the cosmic environment itself, since all things are linked together by rigorous correspondences. Well, here we have a society where the reign of quantity is in full swing, and most people are doing a job that has nothing to do with the intrinsic qualities of their nature.
Right.
And I'm not like a green environmentalist warning you that the world's going to be destroyed. I don't think we can destroy the physical world or nature. But that being said, we have created a seriously disordered environment, at least in the areas in which we live and that we have any relationship to. So he goes on and says, according to the traditional conception, it is the essential qualities of beings that determine their activity. According to the profane conception, on the other hand, these qualities are no longer taken into account, and individuals are regarded as no more than interchangeable and purely numerical units. The latter conception can only logically lead to the exercise of a wholly mechanical activity, in which there remains nothing truly human, and that is exactly what we see happening today. It need hardly be said that the mechanical activities of the moderns, which constitute industry properly so called, and are only a product of that profane deviation, can afford no possibility of an initiatic kind, and further, they cannot be anything but pure obstacles to the development of all spirituality. And the last thing we should add to this is he does a great deal to explain how in this previous artisanal expression of humanity, that not only did the person express their essential quality through their work, but the work itself was imbued with that essential quality. And the uniqueness was an expression of the essential quality of a spirit, an actual authentic human being. He goes on to say, it may be remarked, referring to the machine age, that the machine is in a sense the opposite of the tool. And it is in no way a perfected tool, as many imagine, for the tool is in a sense a prolongation of the man himself, whereas the machine reduces the man to being no more than its servant. And if it was true to say that the tool engenders the craft, it is no less true that the machine kills it. The instinctive reactions of the artisans against the first machines thus explain themselves. So, man, this is such an important aspect of it all.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I have that highlighted as well, so I'm really glad you brought that up. What it reminds me of as well is this idea that every occupation, supposedly in the traditional world, was a priesthood. And so if you were, no matter what it was, right? Once again, if you were a farmer or a baker or you were a potter or something like that, there was basically a priesthood associated with that, right? And so I think of like the guild system,
Like a
right?
guild, yeah.
Yep. And so that is not the case anymore. And so a lot of people's occupations today are so new,
but they have unions, Mario. A lot of good those
there
do.
You go. Yeah, exactly right. A lot of people's jobs are so new, there hasn't been time for there to be anything like that anymore. And of course, it flies in the face of traditional society, the way things are just done now, right? The other thing I think is really fascinating too, with this previous sort of artisanal concept in these traditional systems, is what he says is that people who imbued their spirit and their quality and their essence into their artwork didn't necessarily need or look for credit as well. That he was saying that, I believe, signatures and kind of putting your name on something is actually more of a modern concept. That as man has sort of fallen, now we want credit for things. But he says this was not the case at all, like in the previous ages, So I think that that's a really interesting sort of idea too. But I can't not think of this priesthood thing with occupations and stuff. I think that is so fascinating, and it makes so much sense that everything was really kind of truly like that. And if I'm being honest, I'm grateful that I live in today's world, but I think about a lot of these concepts, and it makes me kind of like long for something. What a time to be alive when these things, where every single thing in your life mattered and had meaning. And just like what you're saying, people didn't necessarily even think about it that way. But literally everything you wore, how you kind of like went throughout the day, how you spoke, what you read, your different holy days, all of this stuff, it was all imbued with meaning.
And it's to the point that it's incomprehensible to moderns.
Yeah, exactly. It's true.
And we're just trying to figure it out from our quantitative mindset, like, well, this must equal this. And you're trying to boil it down to definitions. And that's even something that I have found to be a weakness in my approach to symbolism, mythology, and spiritual concepts that I'm trying to rectify, to not just syncretize, but become a centrist and delve into the inherent essential meaning behind things, as much as I try to quantitatively equate like one god to another or one symbol to another, because there's really no value in that. Theosophists did that all day, and that wasn't so useful. I want to talk about this in terms of the individuation aspect of society too, because this is a huge part of the weave that pertains to the society at large, which is going to require some reading, and then we can expand on it. But he says, the conclusion is this: quantity will predominate over quality in individuals to the extent that they approach a condition in which they are, so to speak, mere individuals and nothing more, and to the extent that they are thereby more separate one from another. And it must be emphasized that this does not mean that they are more differentiated, for there's also a qualitative differentiation, which is properly speaking the opposite of that quantitative differentiation in which the separation in question consists. This separation turns individuals into so many units and turns their collectivity into quantitative multiplicity. At the limit, these individuals would be no more than something comparable to the imagined atoms of the physicists, deprived of every qualitative determination. And although this limit can never in fact be reached, it lies in the direction which the world is today following. A mere glance at things as they are is enough to make it clear that the aim everywhere is to reduce everything to uniformity, whether it be the human beings themselves or the things among which they live. And it is obvious that such a result can only be obtained by suppressing as far as possible every qualitative distinction. But it is particularly to be noted that some people, through a strange delusion, are all too willing to mistake this uniformization for a unification, whereas it is really exactly the opposite, as must appear evident in the light of the ever more marked accentuation of separativity implied. It must be insisted that quantity can only separate, and cannot unite. That's the, that's the last part that needs to be comprehended. Like, uniformity is separation, which seems like paradoxical, right? But the more we basically emulate the crowd or allow the crowd to influence our sense of identity and self, the more separate we feel. And I think the obvious example of that in terms of the extreme is the modern left, you could say, which symbolically is the lower half of this polarity in terms of the yin and yang in the first place. That they talk all the time about democracy and unity and these type of things, but they're all absolutely uniform in their opinions, and they're all completely separate and depressed from their isolation to the point of like, they're shut-ins and they still wear masks right now and things like that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so, and where are, where does liberalism really take hold and kind of a lot of the new sort of ideas and concepts with the left? Like, where does it come from? The left coast, the West Coast, and, obviously just kind of what I mentioned earlier regarding the Bay Area and all of that. No, that's exactly right. And so the fact that we're all assigned numbers too, obviously our social security number, and the fact too, what was I just going to say? Oh, census taking. He talks about that as well. Kind of this obsession with census taking and making sure that we have everything sort of accounted for and all of that. The legal world, I think of like receipts. I think of documentation, of paperwork. I think of too, even, just our computers and phones. It's like our phones are little number generators. That's pretty much what they are. And they're in our pocket, right? But yeah, I think this idea, the uniformity, kind of having a different, meaning behind it than what people sort of realize makes all the sense in the world. Because what he really says is that if there's uniformity or this idea of uniformity, then there's actually no real hierarchy. And in his world, this idea of a spiritual hierarchy is everything, that there is actually a sort of apex, or there is this supreme unity, right? So that would be the very top of the pyramid. So if everything's flattened out, there is no spiritual hierarchy to speak of. And it's got me thinking, some of these ideas have got me thinking about the idea of as above, so below, and how we first say as above, so below, not so below as above, because in Guenon's world, basically everything is a descent from this higher order, from the top of that pyramid, right? And so
opposed to materialism that says it's particles that build up from the bottom up.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so, and again, this hierarchy, using the wheel as a metaphor, would be the center of the wheel. Maybe actually, unless you have anything else that you want to riff off of, you can actually show a couple of the images towards the end of my slide show there. So I'm thinking maybe like number 11, and then we can kind of go from there.
Sounds good. Yeah, we'll do this stuff, and we'll circle back around to coinage and
yes,
and philosophy and some of the other problems with scientific materialism. But there's so much to say. It will be a miracle to get a decent quantity of it.
Definitely. I really want to talk about too, just to put a little pin, to circle back around to, he talks about nomadic civilizations versus sedentary civilizations.
We got to do the Cain and Abel stories. Yeah. Never seen it that way before. Amazing.
Yeah, exactly. And actually it applies here too. The lovers, right? Lovers ruled by Gemini, arguably the Gemini twins. I mean, there's a lot of overlap with Romulus and Remus and Cain and Abel. But the main thing I want to point out here, and I don't know if we've ever talked about this, but the angel in the middle, right? So you have Adam and Eve here. And so you have these two pillars, not unlike the Gemini twins, right? Not unlike the pillars of Freemasonry or at a synagogue or what have you. But of course, there's always that central pillar. There's always a middle path or a middle way, which is actually more transcendental than this dualistic sort of idea between maybe solar and lunar, or masculine and feminine, black and white, whatever you want to say, the left-hand path versus the right-hand path or what have you. So I think it's really interesting. I love the way the Rider-Waite portrayed the angel with the basically the sun behind the angel, right? And so it's all of the rays emanating from that sun, right? And this, to me, in my opinion, it actually could be indicative of a, you know, like a central sun sort of concept, right? And so this angel is coming from the central location. You know, that's what the spokes are sort of symbolic of, right? They all go back to the hub of the wheel, basically. So they are coming from a higher plane of existence, which, if you use the wheel metaphor, it's the center of the wheel. And so if you
Up is in, out is down.
There you go. If you click through maybe a couple more slides, you'll see what I mentioned earlier. One more. Right. So he gets into this as well. I can't remember what book he really got into this, but basically the outer
probably
portion
the cross
of the wheel,
one.
Perhaps. Yeah. I could see that. The outer portion of the wheel being related to Earth, the center of the wheel being heaven, and then the spokes of the wheel symbolically could be related to man as well. And so there's a triune dynamic with the wheel itself. And so the angel or the angle is coming from the center, right? And so it's the center of the wheel that creates these different angles, not unlike a pie chart or whatever, and not unlike a compass that creates angles, right? And is more so related to a circle, which circles and spheres are more so related to heaven, right? I find this fascinating as well because, you know me, I'm all about the pole star and everything else. And so the center of the wheel of heaven, basically, symbolically, it really relates to this supreme unifying principle that exists in the middle of all things, the point of pivot for all things. And so if you click through just to the next slide, I mean, so, you know, Buddha meditating in the middle of the wheel. Yeah, makes sense. Non-duality, right? Supreme unity, principal unity, whatever you want to say.
This is what I saw on DMT back in the day.
Is that right?
Just a lot more colorful.
Right on.
I'm not even kidding either. Like this exact shape of and
Wow.
I wasn't interested in these topics back then. I would have never even known the word Dharma chakra. But I kid you not, this was like something I saw more than once in my 20s on DMT.
There you go, man. I mean, I'm inclined to think basically when you are on psychedelics, right, you're opened up and you see the meaning behind things. That's why it's so fun and that's why it's so transformative. You're not seeing things through the mundane, profane kind of modern lens, right? This is actually kind of interesting too, because I have highlighted here to bring up what he mentions about ordinary life and how the concept of just an ordinary, boring kind of life, a dead kind of life that moderns have was like not a thing at all in the golden age. People had a complete
just
opposite.
Normal is synonymous with uniformity.
Right. There you go. Exactly right. Yeah. And we're conditioned to think this, right? It's like I remember watching TV and watching these shows and like all of these people are jaded. They're all jaded. They're all bored. The 90s was like a huge part of that, you know, so you're young and youthful and you have the rest of your life ahead of you. You have all of the potential ahead of you in the world and you're bored and you're sick of living and nothing's fun or exciting or anything anymore. Well, I can kind of see why that would be the case when you're living in a profane sort of reality, basically, and everything is material and, you know, everything is reduced down to materialism and the lens that you're kind of taught to see everything through would be scientific materialism. So there's no spiritual quality to anything. There's no meaning behind anything.
He also makes some good points about the earth element itself being the representation of this quantitative principle, that it's symbolized by the cube, which is again this like the symbol of this lower pole, and you know that the earth is not really meant, it doesn't really mean the physical stuff, but it means like this sensible substantive aspect of you know, side of the coin, you could say. And that's you know, that's an interesting take too, because the elements were the entry point for me to shift my perspective into qualitative thinking rather than quantitative. Right. Because in the modern chemistry, they have appropriated the word element and designated it to refer to a categorization or a census of different natural and artificial materials based on their assumed quantitative differences of particles, subatomic particles, right? Like the difference between hydrogen and helium is 1 proton, neutron, and electron, or 2 of each. And up the scale, it's just a purely purely continuous numerical sequence that they're calling elements. And somehow that is, there's like a specific quote he says regarding the folly of materialism, that matter is at once called inert, but they also, here he says, modern physicists in their efforts to reduce quality to quantity have arrived at a sort of logic of error to the point of confusing the two, and thence to the attribution of quality itself to their matter as such. And they end by assigning all reality to matter, or at least all that they are capable of recognizing as reality. That's what constitutes materialism. To speak of the properties of matter while asserting at the same time that matter is inert is an insoluble contradiction. And he makes some cool distinctions too, even in the etymological origin of this word matter, that there's materia prima and materia secunda. And so the primal materia, the original source material, is more of this qualitative, essential, upper or central or inner polarity, whereas the secunda would be the emanative quality of the substance and sensible nature of matter itself, which is an important distinction, because we're just thinking of matter like it's the physical hard stuff. But in our experience of reality, there's really, we're talking about, again, two sides of the same coin. There's really not a separation between the substance and the essence.
Right. Exactly.
It's both embodied in one. So it's not that we should throw out the sensible or the substantive. We can't. It's an intrinsic part of the reality. But to somehow confuse the two, that the substance is what gives the qualities, is the inversion. It's the qualities that create the substance. And in the same way, even bodies are described that way by Guenon, that you're, and this is the hard problem of consciousness, is perfectly enucleates this issue, that they are constantly seeking and striving to answer this question of like, how does the brain and neurochemistry generate consciousness? Well, it's probably just an illusion anyway, and it probably doesn't exist. And this is the problem of their attempt to source the greater from the lesser.
Yes.
And that's the whole issue. And that's why I always like to say, your mind is not in your body. Your body is in your mind, and then that's like the ultimate unlock of exiting stage left from a normal life and more into the artisanal, spiritual, vocational expression of reality, which I thank God for every day, that my life gets to be the vocational expression of doing what I feel like I'm here to do and what I actually resonate with on a soul level. And that's the most important thing to me about the even mission of the show, is to try to, originally the mission of the show was for me to figure out how to do that while I was juggling my, material existence and the fear of lack, quantitative lack, against trying to create something that mattered to me. And no one could tell me how to do it. No one could tell me how. I would interview artists left and right. But the answer, now that I'm there, is it's a leap of faith. That's why faith and religion, that's why it's a religious act, your creative expression, your vocational expression. That even being brave enough to prioritize that, regardless of any perceived quantitative lack or risk, is a leap of faith that proves the essential aspect of reality, because there is a emergence or an emanation of materia or security or wealth or coinage that comes out of that expression of the primal essence of your being. And it's not something that you can necessarily draw a line to how it works. It's like you need something and it just shows up. But and you can't, and it's not this consistent clock in, clock out, guaranteed this amount of money every week type of reality. It's just not, but it's a leap of faith. But I hope somebody out there that needs to hear that is hearing that and can make the leap, because ultimately that's how you can get yourself out of the Kali Yuga. As much as it is evident that this pattern is overlaid to the majority of humanity in a collective sense, there is no reason why it has to be the Kali Yuga for you. It's just not how it is. Like you can de-invert this, you can revert this back to the proper, polarization or prioritization at any point. And it's fast too. It's really fast, but it's a leap of faith.
That's right, man. Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, and well put, dude. That was a great stream of thought right there with everything. Because I do have here too, prosperity, abundance being on the qualitative side, scarcity, right, lack, as you put it, on the quantitative side. And it kind of reminds me of a Bob Marley quote, and he said something along the lines of like something about numbers, and that if you're chasing numbers, you're never going to be happy because numbers never end, basically, is what he's saying, right? So it's really interesting that we're talking about this wheel dynamic. And so that's right. If you have $1 million, you're probably going to wonder, hey, what would it be like to have 5 million? And then once you have 5, 10 and 20 and whatever, it never ends, basically. And so this is his whole entire framework, is going back to that center, right? Versus just constantly expanding outward and searching for external validation or what have you, things outside of self. That's like an endless sort of pursuit. I understand why people do that though, right? I think a lot of times searching outside of self is just symbolic of sort of a yearning for an internal search, and actually, it's interesting too, just this sort of faith dynamic. There's a lot of different religious sort of like lifestyles that promote this whole idea. And right now I'm thinking about Indian culture, as I kind of do, but right now is the Kumbh Mela. And the Kumbh Mela is the biggest celebration in the world. And so every 12 years, they have a Mahakumbh, which is like the big Kumbh Mela. And this is the year that they're having. It's literally happening right now. The greatest, largest gathering on earth is happening right now in India. And a lot of people come from, these hermetic sort of lifestyles where they're living in isolation. They literally might be living in a cave or living in a jungle or living in the foothills or whatever. And this is the one time. It happens every 3 or 4 years, but the big one happens every 12 years. This is when they come together and they have an open exchange of information. This is where a lot of people find their guru. It's interesting that it's happening during Aquarius season as well, because Aquarius is Kumbh, and it's a very Aquarian festival. And so it's called the celebration of the pot, which is interesting because an empty pot, what I've read in my resources, an empty pot or an empty bowl symbolically represents poverty. And so you want your cup to be full, right? If you see a homeless person on the street, they're probably going to have a vessel, if they're begging. And so that empty vessel is symbolic of having faith that the universe is going to provide, in a way. And there are some sects in India where you're literally not allowed to have more than, I think, like a loincloth, a pot, and like a walking stick or something. And that basically this is their faith that they're going to get by if they just kind of commit to their spiritual, aspirations, basically. And if they just be and exist. But they do have a system over there where they really support people who do that, right? And so you can live that kind of lifestyle. And just like what you said, if you have faith, it's like the universe rewards that kind of courage and will manipulate things, in your favor, if this is your true authenticity to sort of live out, right? I think. And so so anyways, just to add on to kind of what you're saying there regarding the faith dynamic and that you can make it happen. People have been doing it forever. So you can do it too, for sure.
And in the East, it's more commonly done in a sort of nomadic way. He talks about too how like the East, as much as it's adopted Western materialism, it's not really as pervasive as it is in the West, with maybe some differences now compared to back in Guenon's day. But this whole thing kind of makes me less concerned about the rise to power of China, for example, although they're very westernized and collectivized in a sense. But, it's just this whole degradation of our civilization because of the materialist ideal is like, that's the it ends itself. Like it's its own end, and nothing could stop you from having a good life despite it. But I want to give a little bit of the math gravy about this to help comprehend how the quantitative thinking is influencing the sciences and why it's so erroneous. So first of all, there's this idea of number, and the pure idea of number or quantity is whole number. And what that means is the sequence of whole numbers is what's called a discontinuous series, meaning that 1 is separate from 2 is separate from 3, even though there's theoretically an extension that is infinite or indefinite, I should say. And we did a whole stream about problems with the word infinite as it's used, and it was from a Guenon book. That was a while back. But there's an indefinite extension between each discontinuous number in the series, right? But when we talk about quantity, we usually refer to it in the pure idea of a discontinuous series of whole numbers. Now, Guenon says that all the extensions that have been applied to this idea and that have given rise to the notions of fractional numbers and incommensurable numbers, imaginary numbers, negative numbers, etc., there are real alterations and only in fact represent the efforts that have been made so far to reduce as far as possible the intervals in the numerical discontinuity as to lessen the imperfection inherent in the application of number to continuous magnitudes. So to decipher that a little bit, he's saying that all this crazy mathematics that have gotten further and further complicated are like sort of a flailing about of the simulators, or the ones that create reality simulations through the abstractions of algebra to try to explain it or to demonstrate that reality is somehow emergent from these numbers, like a computer simulation. And the further they go into it, the further into simulacra their reality becomes. I mean, most of what passes for astrophysics are some computer simulations that are plugged in numbers of different, formulas of various supposed universal laws and constants. And then when those things spit out some kind of simulation that approximates what they think they've observed in the heavens, they're like, aha, we've discovered something, but all they did was put numbers into a computer.
Right.
And so we got to understand that the quantitative discontinuous series of number are like the application of that to reality as like a ground up interpretation of how things manifest and are formed is the origin of this atomistic concept, and everything that spirals out of it, from viruses to, nuclear physics. And go see my conversations with the PhD Stephen Young about, why he left behind nuclear physics and picked up alchemy. But essentially, in one, this discontinuous aspect of pure number introduces its discontinuity into the materialist notion of matter by way of constantly cutting it up into smaller and smaller particles that is essentially never ending. Whereas Guenon says the very fact that this is contradictory to the very fact that the material from which bodies are formed cannot in any case be conceived otherwise than as extended. So meaning that just like there's technically an infinite or an indefinite stretch of potential divisions or continuity between what we call numbers, or say applying number to space, that between, this is part of Zeno's paradoxes, right? This was his way of trying to throw out this atomism and quantitative, onset of the Kali Yuga way back in the day, and everyone was just like, this guy's crazy. But essentially that he would say that, Achilles could never catch a tortoise that he was chasing, because first he would have to, it's 9 feet, or if it's 10 feet away, and first you'd have to run 5 feet to catch it, and then half the distance, and then you'd have to run 2.5 feet, and then, dividing it, and basically like creating further and further fractional intervals that would never end, as an endless series of fractional divisions. And that's essentially what atomism and particle physics and the quantum realm is all about. I mean, quantum is even just a reference to quantity, right?
Right.
So the point is, though, your body and everything in this universe is continuous and it's indefinite, and these abstractions of quantitative application are not the reality. They're just a manner of describing. And this is hopefully, not too heady and making sense, but this statement sums it up really nicely from Guenon. Quantity is never really that which is measured. It is, on the contrary, that by which things are measured. And furthermore, it can be said that the relation of measure to number corresponds in an inversely analogical sense to the relation of manifestation to its essential principle. So quantity is never really you're never actually measuring quantity. You can't measure quantity. Quantity is what you measure with. It's not the thing you're measuring. And that's the big that's the way that everybody's backwards in the mainstream, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I love that you brought up quantum being related to quantity. I hadn't even thought about that, to be honest with you. I don't know if but
no, he was aware of those shenanigans, I'm sure.
Right. Because I wonder, even when quantum as like a term, it even became a thing. I don't know if
it was starting to gain, steam around the same time as the special theory of relativity, which he also criticizes.
Gotcha. That's an excellent point, dude. I love that. And so, one of the things too, there's so many different ways of explaining what's going on here. And one of the ways, as you were talking, that kind of came to mind is literally how people are more cerebral and mental and less heart-based in the modern world as well. That's another like proper analogy there. And so a lot of people over intellectualize everything. A lot of people, they're suppressing their emotions. They think they can outthink everything. They think they can kind of problem solve their way through life without actually feeling the flow of emotions. And so, like in the tarot, the mind corresponds with the sword. And so the sword, what does the sword do? It divides, right? It cuts, it severs. And so this is what being analytical is all about. You're seeing the differences between things. You're not seeing the similarities between things. And so I even say that the four basic elements have a correspondence with the 4 basic mathematical functions. And I put it that division is related to air, which is related to swords, right? Our hearts like to synthesize. Our hearts like to see the similarities over differences. It's not unlike the chalice, or it's not unlike the cup that brings things together, right? And so to me, the quantity sort of perspective lines up with the over mentalization that kind of plagues everybody today, basically, right? And so I'm sure you know a lot about that with people, with tuning sessions and things like that, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. I mean, well, the over mentalization thing is basically like the heart is feeling, and it's the center, and the mind is more like it's actually the exact same metaphor as mistaking quantity for essence, that the mind is not the thing being measured, so to speak. It's the thing you measure with. And the thing that's actually the essential aspect is the feeling, right? And if you're just strictly in the mind and you lose track of feeling, well, then that's the first step towards the uniformitization and the acceptance of a like despiritualized experience or a roboticized experience that, that's everybody's job. Everyone's interchangeable. You just take the training and follow the instructions. I mean, that's a big part. Actually, this is interesting. A big part of tunings in Aquarius season, I always notice particular themes that come up when the sun changes a tropical sign. And one of the most common themes in sessions since we went into Aquarius is people needing to have a reset on their sense of inner authority, you could say, or heart-driven authority. That people's issue that was common between many sessions is the looking external for approval or to be told how to do a thing or for the instructions or did I do it right, you know? And this statement I'm about to say, it sounds like blasphemy to most people out there, especially those of the religious mindset in the age of materialism in the Kali Yuga, the sort of, you know, anti-traditional religious mindset, as Guenon would put it. But what I essentially try to get them to a place where they can internalize the rectified belief about self that my way of doing things is the right way. And you hear that, or people say that the first time they try to say it out loud, like, I can't say that. That's no, you know that. But the reason being because they're afraid of like, well, that's a power trip, or that's egotistical, or that's immoral to think my way is the right way. That's moral relativism. And I'm like, no. If you are in tune with your true self, well, your true self is good. Your intrinsic self is good. And if you have trust that yourself is good and you have the connection to your heart and your God-given conscience, then there's no reason why the statement, my way is the right way, would have anything immoral or wrong about it. You know, and that's an important aspect of getting out of the normal life uniformity is, and, you know, out of the need for instruction manuals and training videos.
Right.
I mean, I had to learn this in tuning too, but like particularly in energy healing type of practices or any kind of like spiritual practices that you're going to start doing for yourself, is there's a point where you got to get comfortable with making it up as you go. Not in a sense that it's inauthentic, but that's what makes it authentic. Like being connected to essence or source. Well, what's the nature of the essence of source? Is the creative power, the generative power. So the feeling of making it up as you go is actually you being in resonance with your essential quality. And that is so important.
Dude, absolutely. This relates to the mental and heart-based sort of dynamic with things. The heart being sort of the symbolic seat of your spiritual impulse, and the heart being related to that, and the mysteries. It's called the mysteries for a reason, you know? So you have to embrace the mystery of things. And so if you don't, I think you're going to have a lot tougher road ahead of you, basically. And so this is what scientific materialism promises people, modern people, is that they've got all the answers. They've shed light on everything. There's no more questions. Everything's figured out. There's an authoritative figure for everything, any subject, you know, there's an expert that you can rely upon. So just rely on the experts, right? Of course, because they've done the work and they've gone to school and everything else. There you go. Yeah.
Peter Shaw, mystery, my story. That's right.
Yep. Yeah. 100%. So I think that is really well put as well. So real quick, the coinage dynamic. He has this chapter, the degeneration of coinage. And that's one of the reasons why I love what he brings to the table. There's so many little things I've just never heard of before that really get me thinking about things. Kind of related to this, he has an article. It's not in any of his books. He wrote prolifically. There's a bunch of articles that you won't find in print, but I read it, and he talks about gold. And he talks about how gold was so sacred in the primordial tradition in the ancient world that to think that you can own it was completely nonsense. That this was basically that if you owned it, you're robbing other people of a thing that belongs to everybody, basically. That this was like an inverse sort of logic back then, that you can actually hoard or own a piece of gold. And as man continued to fall, obviously that really changed. And so now people hoard gold and all this other stuff. Similarly, kind of related, in this chapter of the degeneration of coinage, he says that coins were sacred totems, that they started off as sacred totems, that the value was spiritual, basically, right? With the iconography and the symbolism that was actually on the coin. And as man continued to fall, that now the value is only based on purchasing power. which is totally what the world has kind of, been distilled down to. Everything is about purchasing power. Everything can be bought, or people think that, right? And so literally the elements in your body, you've probably seen that breakdown, right? How much all of the elements in your body are worth, how much your organs are worth, everything, right? So the person who's only thinking in quantitative purchasing power terms, that's how they walk through life, and that's how they see everything. So they see relationships as something to be bought and sold and everything else, right? So I just thought that was fascinating. This idea of the coin once even having a completely different symbolic representation than how people see it today.
Also, the word coin is cognate with Cohen, which is a word for a priest, and or king or ken. So it's about gnosis. I ken a thing, I know it, and it's about, and that word relates to the kingship. And Dylan and I look at old coins all the time in our Inner World series because they are one of the more consistently useful artifacts that pair together imagery symbolism with words. And also they demonstrate, in my opinion, the as Guenon calls it, the solidification of history, that as this descent into materialism or the solidification of the world progresses, that even what we're able to see of history, even through artifacts, it changes and reduces. And there's like sideweave, but if you've ever heard of psychic archaeology, it's a really interesting concept that people find what they expect to find when they go out on a dig. My dad, being a professional treasure hunter, yeah, he digs up coins and stuff all the time. Not as old as like old Roman stuff, but because we're here in the States. But he has a psychic sense about him of where to go, and he does this he doesn't know it's psychic, I'm sure. He's not really on this level headiness wise, but the way that he goes out to find artifacts, he's particularly into Civil War artifacts, is he looks for, he goes to places where maybe there's some historiographical account of a battle or troop movements. And then he puts himself in the shoes of being a soldier in the Civil War and feels it out. Like, where would I want to go if I was around here? So like, where is there some nice shade? Where is there nice water by shade? Where's like a good vantage point or whatever? And he feels it out, and then he finds stuff, and he finds the type of things he's looking for too. I think that there's a psychic aspect to that, but with the coinage, to return to that weave, the typical interpretation by modern academics in terms of these coins that have gods and religious symbolism and the names of gods on the coins is that they will then say that that was the king of the era that came out of,
right?
And there's so much potential in our misunderstanding of history to the possibility most of it is wrong, and that the ideas of various rulers and kings, as we've been given in the story of the ancient world, are more of a mythology extension of astrotheology than they are a legitimate record of physical events. I think the coins are a good example of that, because we see these coins and supposedly it was, this one's Queen Berenike of Egypt, when in fact she, in both her biography and the symbolism on the coinage, represents every single possible quality of Virgo that you could imagine in the Queen of Heaven.
Right.
But no, that was a real person, and all these kings have names that completely resonate to solar or planetary qualities, but they're real people.
Yeah, no, exactly right. I mean, one of the sort of side notes that I have here, just another interesting example of going to school and learning about the planets. But what part about the planets are you learning about? All of the material, supposed scientific aspects about the planets, right? What they're composed of elementally, how far they are away from Earth, what their orbits are like, blah, blah, blah. But you never, ever get around, at least I didn't get around in my education, to the meaning behind these planets, which was of supreme importance in the ancient world, right?
Laughed at now.
Laughed at.
You'd be laughed at for bringing that up.
Exactly.
Nor did they really ever, like, I remember a high school mythology class and nobody ever really went further than the planets had the same names as the gods. And that was it.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, exactly right.
But on the subject of coinage and the debasement of the currency, one of the things to consider is that in ancient world, the the value of currency was based on the quality of the metal. And now there's this weird pseudo echo of that, as Guenon predicts actually that the debasement of currency and the quantitative expansion of currency will eventually make it become non-existent in sort of a microcosm of the way that the materialist or the quantitative philosophy will remove its own self from existence eventually.
Right. Yeah.
And he was not aware, but like the old world, what clued you into the quality of gold in a coin was you bit it. You bite it. It's soft enough to bite, then you know that you got a gold coin. Now we have Bitcoin, which is
Right,
the logo for which is a gold coin, but it's completely digital. There's nothing physically there. And not only are we moving towards a purely digital, aka quantitative, nothing but numbers in an abstract realm of non-physicality, but also there's all these whispers and assumptions of a future universal basic income, which is essentially not a debasement of currency as much as a nullification of the original purpose of currency.
Right.
But at the very least, there's nothing left in the qualitative essence of currency whatsoever. It's just inert paper or common material alloys with nothing precious in terms of the qualitative metals in play. So that's interesting.
No, you're exactly right. Exactly. One thing I was just going to mention regarding metal detecting, right? That's what your dad does.
Yeah.
There's really a guy on YouTube. I thought it was a really cool technique. I saw this years ago, and I thought it was interesting. And what he would do, he would go out with tuning forks, or no, excuse me, what are they called? The rods,
dowsing rods.
Dowsing rods, yeah. And so he would go out with dowsing rods, and he would use that to find a location on where he should actually detect. And, he could have been making up his process, or that he could have buried coins, or who knows what, edited to make it seem like he was right on the money with that. But that was his thing. And apparently it worked out really, really, really well for him. And so I think that that's kind of a cool technique. I can see myself getting into this at some point. Metal detecting.
Anybody can use dowsing rods. There's no qualification necessary.
Right.
I use them all the time. I use them in my tuning practice. They're really helpful. I mean, they essentially let you measure qualities of your own distinction. And that's super fascinating. Like, I'm doing remote healings, and I measure whether or not I need to look into one particular area of someone's energy field or not. I essentially, like, before the session starts, go through from top to bottom in the distinction of chakras and front, back, left, right. And I ask the rods at each of these quadrants, and whether if they open, then that indicates to me that that's a clear area we don't need to look into. If they don't open, then there's potential there. If they go inverted, then that's like a trouble spot. And they are never wrong. And using that process, a lot of tuners will use pendulums for a similar purpose. But I feel like I get a better sort of trinary response out of yes, no, mega yes. If they invert. It speeds up the process of I don't have to explore and waste time. I can target straight to the areas that are asking for help, and they're never wrong. So it's really helpful. But that was what got me into dowsing rods, was somebody at a metaphysical fair was using it to measure the where somebody's arc field began. And then they showed me that you could do it at each chakra level. And I was like, what? And this was before I became a tuner, but I remembered that. But okay, I want to, there's a couple other things I want to get into regarding the quantity and quality of space and time. And then to talk about the Cain and Abel stuff, because if there's anything else I want to make sure we get in, I think that's super relevant. So one of the elements of materialism is that they treat space as if there was such a thing as a empty vacuum with no quality to it whatsoever, right? I mean, that's pretty much the definition of space, is like, it's a big void, emptiness. Now, Guenon says if space were purely quantitative, it would have to be entirely homogeneous, and its parts would have to be indistinguishable one from another by any characteristic other than respective sizes. This would amount to conceiving it as no more than a container without content, aka a void. Now, this isn't like, not to quote him exactly, but what I got out of what I inferred out of how this chapter progressed was that we consider, say, okay, how would you indicate a spatial measurement or a direction, right? You'd say it is a mile to the west or to the east or to the north, right?
Right.
So if you were just to say something is a mile away, there's that quantitative distinction gives absolutely no information, right? So just intrinsically, when we apply quantity to space, there's a requirement of quality to be attached to that for there to be any information carried at all. And so that immediately engenders the notion that the directionality of space itself has intrinsic quality, because otherwise it would have no distinctive capacity. So immediately there's no emptiness in that sense, because that direction, even if there's nothing physically solid between you and that direction, there's still the quality of the direction itself. So that is not emptiness. There's an essential somethingness about it, regardless of a perception of a void in that direction. I think that's important.
Right. Does this relate to, by chance, or at least what it makes me think of is just the fact of what up and down represents just inherently across the board? I'm pretty sure Guenon has written about this as well. This universal up and universal down that all of humanity has, and that if you don't adhere to this dynamic, there's a lot of symbolism that is going to be completely lost to you, basically, because this was a concrete sort of dynamic. Up, unification, heaven, ascension; down, earth, dissension, materialization, etc. So up and down, just even by itself, just conceptually, has all of these different things sort of associated with it.
Right. And you could consider maybe the self-evident aspect of that symbolism being that when you are energized and coherent and powerful and strong, you are upright.
Yeah, right.
When you're depleted or deceased, you are on the ground, you are low, or in the ground. Or when you're sleeping, you become horizontal. I mean, just in the very nature of our bipedal locomotion,
right,
versus our horizontal, like sometimes we say when it's time to sleep, like, I need to get horizontal.
yeah.
So that's and understanding that as well, that in the breadth of symbolism and the way we can equate these ideas across a micro macro spectrum, that we get horizontal to recuperate, gives you a clue as to the reason cosmically for this descent into material solidity. That it's actually a recuperation phase, and it's not intrinsically wrong or evil or to be feared. It's like, on the other side of this, we wake up, it's a new day, and we're full of vigor, life, and essence.
I love it, man. That's great. I love that point. That's excellent. This just basic sort of idea reminds me of, I believe it's the Nine of Swords.
Some of us are just early risers. I'm a morning person. I think we're already awake.
No,
wake up before other people.
That's beautiful, dude. But Nine of Swords. So there's 9 swords horizontally above this woman who is in bed. The bed is horizontal, as you're saying. That's how you get rest. But she is upright, and she is basically not resting because something is bothering her, right? There's something that she just has gone through that's keeping her up at night. So she's unable to rest. So I think it's interesting. All of the swords are horizontal. The bed is horizontal, and she's actually in bed, but she is vertical. So she's not experiencing that rest, pretty much. But yeah, I love what you just said there, man. That's great.
So in the same way, the quality of space is also indicated through shape, because it would be manifestly absurd in Guenon's terminology to say that a square and a triangle that had an equivalent, not the area, not volume, but equivalent area in terms of how much space they take up, were actually the same thing. A triangle is not a square. And this is the essence of the idea of elements, or the Platonic solids as they relate to elements. That there are, even though geometrically the only distinction we're making is in the shape of this space that has a quantitative equivalency, it is not the same. It has a different quality. And that should be also self-evident to the point that space itself has to have an essential quality based on what's in the space, like the shape of the space or the container. It's not just a container empty of contents. And, for sake of brevity, he essentially gives this same type of determination to time, that different periods of time are qualitatively different based on the events that unfold within them, just like the container or the parts of space are different by the bodies they contain.
Yeah.
So it is in no way, in his terms, justifiable to regard as being really equivalent durations of time that are quantitatively equal when they're filled with totally different sequences of events. Now, this is where you really start to separate from the normal life uniformity. And I've only ever had glimpses of it before myself, like moments of it, but this is like, believe it or not, I have had experiences where time not only expanded or contracted, but actually paused. I have exited time before. I don't know how. It had to do with the experience of love. That's all I know. It was related to the experience of love. And one of the times there was, LSD involved. But essentially, there have been a couple of experiences in my past where, as long as I wanted to be in a particular moment, that moment eternally persisted. And it was kind of like, the best way to describe it was that the environment around me was almost like in a loop, but it wasn't looping in the way that you would experience like a video that just was on repeat and started over. It's harder to describe than that. And in fact, in the moments where I started to try to go back into the discernment of the events around me, was part of what took me out of that eternality.
Yeah, there you go.
Essentially, it's like, as long as I wanted to be in it, I could stay in that moment perpetually. Booty Yoga gets it. He's been there. It's a thing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, to use the wheel metaphor once again, when you get to the center of the wheel and you're the unmoved mover, the wheel spins around you. You're in the middle, and that is immutable, and it's outside of time. It's timeless, essentially. That's my understanding of things. And so it relates to this non-dualistic center, and you got there, and so that's
accidentally.
Beautiful. Accidentally, yeah. And you could do it intentionally, though.
But I imagine that this is what Guenon is trying to describe when he talks about the eternal instant of the shift out of the Kali Yuga into a golden age again.
Right.
And if the world as we know it would kind of cease to exist if we froze time in that way, because everything about how our world works is based on this quantitative, what day is it today? What's happening today? Type of thing. Now, the other element of this is how the Yuga cycle, they're described in the Pythagorean Tetractys as being, the golden age being a 4, the silver age being a 3, the bronze age being a 2, and the iron age being a 1. And I think this is kind of reminiscent of the way that as you age, time seems to speed up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And the time has this compressing effect. But on top of that, this is sort of the philosophical way of describing the qualitative distinction in time from one era to another, which is important. That one stretch of time is not the same as another stretch of time. Anybody that's been to a really badass music festival knows that a weekend like that feels more like a full week or maybe more in terms of the amount of time that it feels like you have there.
Right, right. Yeah, exactly. You know, to me, what it reminds me of, and I've been talking to Emily Moyer about techno music and rave culture and sort of things like that. It reminds me, it's almost like every rave, every show like that is a pilgrimage location. You're taking a pilgrimage to this sort of sacred center and you're looking for a transcendental experience. That's what a pilgrimage is all about. Generally, the pilgrimage location is where you believe heaven and earth meet. And it's really interesting that she has exposed me to some DJs and some like different scenes within that basically embed like polar symbolism into like the artwork and the music, like very overtly. It's not even like that hidden actually. And so you're going to a spiritual pole basically, right? And so I'm not surprised what she's told me about her experiences and like what you just said right now. It's like you're in the middle of the wheel. That's where you're going to. So, and it could be anything. It's like people make up their own pilgrimage locations too. You know, someone might need to visit this mountain, and to them, that mountain means the world to them, right? Or a lot of times too, even if you don't have like a religion that you belong to or a thing like that, oftentimes what I think your birth location or where you considered your childhood to kind of like take place at, a lot of times that's where you go back to when you die. And when people are kind of reaching the end of life, that is basically sort of their spiritual pole. Like they want to die in their hometown or in their home village or something along those lines. So I've been thinking just about the
Elephant
nature.
graveyard.
Elephant graveyard. Yeah, exactly. So that's very interesting. So the whole thing with Cain and Abel and how it relates to space and time is,
Well, can I set that up one thing?
Phil, yeah, of course. Absolutely.
Because okay, there's also, I've talked about this a lot in the past, so I will make it a little brief, but we only have one word for time in English, but the ancient Greeks had at least two words for time, chronos and kurios. Interestingly, kurios is almost the exact same word as sun, which is symbolic of the sacred center, the solar point, especially Guenon even calls it that, the 6 rays emanating from the center or the cube, if essentially, of the material world are the directions up, down, forward, back, left, right, with the 7th point in the middle. And that's the solar point. Now, so the word kurios means Lord, means son. You know, it's in the Bible. It's what they call Jesus. But it also, with just a slight variation in spelling, but basically pronounced the same way, it means time experienced subjectively. And so the important thing about this is the chronos time, as a distinction, is the compressive time. And what causes time to compress or feel like we have less and less of it, and like it's always running out, is the uniformity of our life. So if we're clocking in Monday through Friday, doing the same thing all week, watching the clock ready to get out of the job, you know, that hamster wheel rat race type of life, that's where things speed up, and before you know it, you blink and your life's over. And then the example of like rave culture or music festivals and how time dilates or expands in those experiences, this is the subjective time where the novelty is what creates the expansiveness, where space starts to take over time because you're exploring space rather than confined and compressed into a single space. And this is where the Cain and Abel metaphor starts to come into play between the nomadic and the agrarian. But suffice to say, the more novelty or differentiation you can bring into both the space that you're in and the qualities of what you're engaged in, the less the less time will compress in on you. The more you'll experience subjective time. And this subjective time is measured by the evolution or the growth of your soul, whereas the chronos time is measured by the uniformity and the stasis of your soul. Like there's nothing changing, you're not doing anything. So, you know, which one you want to be your master,
right?
And that's super important, I think, for life.
Yeah, no, that's spot on. Excellent intro to what we're about to talk about. I'm glad you mentioned that. So what he talks about, he has a whole chapter called Cain and Abel, and he talks about the differences between sedentary cultures, agrarian cultures, and nomadic cultures. and how they view space and time and how it's different, and even like the types of art that they favor and everything else. And so he says that the story of Cain and Abel is basically the story between these different types of civilizations. And I would say that by extension, this is pretty obvious when you look at it, but Romulus and Remus are basically the same exact storyline, pretty much. And so Cain would be symbolic of the agrarian, sedentary, stationary culture that hunkers down, stays put. The artwork that they tend to favor, he refers to as the plastic arts. He says like agriculture, or excuse me, obviously agriculture, but architecture, and then also the visual arts. So he was saying that sedentary peoples favor art that expands over space. So like symbols, right? And visuals and paintings and things like that, right? Which I think is really interesting, because in contrast to that, he also says that nomadic peoples, they tend to favor, because they're always moving, they tend to favor art that unfolds over time, right? So like music and poetry.
Keep it going. I'll be back in just a sec, but you keep on expanding on this, spirit.
Yeah. And so he was saying that basically they favor artwork that unfolds over time, which I think this is really interesting too, because he was saying that it wasn't uncommon for nomadic peoples to be basically anti-symbolic, and that it was almost like against their cultural standard to favor symbolism. It became idolatry, right? That makes sense, especially when you consider like Middle Eastern nomadic peoples and the idea of like, you know, not being able to draw Muhammad and not being able to draw like literally the human form, that was considered to be something that was undesirable, right? And so when Cain kills Abel, it's symbolic of the stationary, sedentary, agrarian culture, basically killing the nomadic lifestyle. And so this makes a lot of sense. I just watched a documentary with this guy who is a nomadic person, and he was completely heartbroken how many towns, this was like in Mongolia or something, how many towns had prevented him from doing his yearly migration. Basically, his whole entire thing was following the swans. So that was his totem animal. Him and his people, they follow the swans, the migration of the swans. And so he was just saying that to do what his family has done for generations is becoming harder and harder and harder and harder, because now there's borders, now there's taxes, now there's all of these different things that are impeding his ability to travel. So to stop a nomadic person from traveling is basically like putting them in prison. And to displace a sedentary peoples is kind of like a symbolic sort of equivalent, basically. It's the worst thing you could possibly do to people. What I found to be really interesting too is he says that nomadic peoples, if they are basically not balanced and grounded and centered, and they're not basically doing that kind of work, that what they do is everything they touch dissolves. That's the word he used. It dissolves. So it's almost like the touch of death. And so there are nomadic peoples that are known for that. They basically become very parasitic. And so no matter where they go, they end up turning everything, they end up subverting everything, and they end up inverting everything. There's a particular tribe I'm thinking about. Maybe you can piece things together. And then he said that
are their hats big or small?
Very good question. And so he was saying that when sedentary peoples, when they are unbalanced and they aren't centered, that basically they fall into aimless materialism, which I'm like, wow, that is so fascinating. That spoke to me quite a bit, with us having grown up in a sedentary agrarian sort of culture. So those are a few things off the top of my head that I thought were really interesting, I think the interface with Romulus and Remus is interesting as well. So when they built the first wall in Rome, my understanding is Romulus lifted every brick physically, and he just did it through manual labor. And Remus actually, in some instances, played like a flute or played an instrument and actually levitated the bricks into place, right? So kind of the musical quality of nomadic peoples. And then I guess Cain is kind of credited for establishing the first town. Romulus established Rome with that first wall. So hunkering down and staying put versus being nomadic, very, very different ways of living life, and very different ways of using space and time, basically.
Yeah. So you got into the fact that the nomadic people being sort of the representatives of time, that their arts are more temporally oriented, like as in poetry and music, where it's about the progression aspect of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Yeah. I mean, that was just a mind blowing weave about how there's two types of people. Yeah. The spatial and the temporally rooted tribes of humanity. And
Right.
then I love that you brought up too the uh, nomadic aspect. I mean, the paradox that we believe that we have more freedom than we've ever had before, but there's basically nowhere in the world where you could just go and exist without being someone else's property that you're trespassing on.
Right.
So,
Right.
and he's got a really good paragraph about this that I want to just read, where he says, in another respect, he's talking about the state of affairs where everything is counted, recorded, and regulated in the human social order as part of the emergence of uniformity and the solidification of the world, which, by the way, he's wicked ahead of his time to be saying that that's where things are going, because we're now at the point where it's not just recorded in linguistically, but it's like there's a video of everything at all times, and more so. He says this ever more inordinate regulation has a highly paradoxical consequence, and it is this: the growing rapidity and ease of communication between the most distant countries, thanks to the inventions of modern industry, are matters of pride. Yet at the same time, every possible obstacle is put in the way of the freedom of these communications, to the extent that it is often practically impossible to get from one country to another. And in any case, it has become much more difficult now than it was when no mechanical means of transport existed.
Right.
I mean, is that not the truth? This is another special aspect of solidification, in which in such a world, there is no longer any room for nomadic peoples such as formerly survived in various circumstances. For these people gradually come to a point at which they no longer find in front of them any free space. And in addition to this, all possible means are used to cause them to adopt a sedentary life. So that in this connection, also, the time seems not to be far distant when the wheel will stop turning. While in addition, within the sedentary life, the towns, representing something like the final degree of fixation, take on an overwhelming importance and tend more and more to absorb everything else. This is how it comes about toward the end of the cycle. Cain really and finally slays Abel.
Yep.
Now,
Yeah.
there was another point that he made here that just blew my mind. I'd never heard, that I have to also read. He says, much could be said about the prohibitions formulated in certain traditions against the taking of censuses, otherwise than in exceptional cases. If it were to be stated that such operations, like all of those of the civil state, as it is called, have, among other inconveniences, that of contributing to the cutting down of the length of human life, and this is anyhow in conformity with the progress of the cycle, especially in later periods, but this statement would simply not be believed. Nevertheless, in some countries, the most ignorant peasants know very well, as a fact of ordinary experience, that if animals are counted too often, far more of them die than if they are not counted. But in the eyes of moderns who call themselves enlightened, such things cannot be anything but superstitious.
Whoa. I don't remember reading that. That's amazing.
Unbelievable.
Very, very interesting. Holy cow. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about, man. Just going through the book and flipping through it and kind of reading passages here and there. I take
the footnotes, dude. The footnotes are where the gravy's at.
Yeah, there's a lot of great footnotes. I completely agree. I don't skip any of those with any of his books. So the interesting thing too, basically, the idea is that, Cain would be, if we're using the Gemini twins as an analogous sort of thing here, Cain clearly is the evil dark twin. Abel would be the good twin. Is he saying, by the way, in your opinion, with all of this, is that nomadic peoples were like some of the original peoples? That this was like more of a common lifestyle, or no? I don't know if I.
No, what he's saying is that from the beginning of our current inception of humanity, agricultural.
There's always been these two.
There's been both. That we think of it as, it started as hunter-gatherers who developed into agricultural civilizations and became sedentary. But he's saying, no, there's always been this duality. And that although probably at the beginning of time, where there's more space and time is less compressed, then the nomadic peoples would have kind of a superiority or like an advantage. And I think we see that even at the beginning of the Kali Yuga, where, or if we're assuming that our perception of history essentially begins around the beginning of the Kali Yuga or something like that, which kind of makes sense, that the nomadic shepherd kings were of the highest level of influence in the world, along with later developing into sort of like seafaring nomadic peoples, a la the Phoenicians or potentially the Etruscans, whoever spread around civilization and their techniques of civilization. But I don't know, maybe in a golden age, there's like a sort of pristine balance between the two. That could be what we're seeing with the Cyclopean architecture that exists all around the world, because there's this blend with that of nomadic and sedentary, that they're building these sacred centers, but they're spreading them out all over the world. So you got to wonder what that's about.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, so what I was going to say is that, you know, Cain in some traditions is like highly revered. So like in Freemasonry, what I've heard is that like people say that Cain is like the first figure that splintered and created the left-hand path, if you will. And that there are certain sects of Freemasonry where they like really highly revere Cain for that reason, pretty much. And then when you're dealing with Freemasonic arts, masonry, obviously that is more of a sedentary sort of art form. Okay. And so you're dealing with stone and you're building buildings and stuff. And so, so what he's saying is that essentially Cain being more of this figure, being sedentary, and it relating to quantity, there's a very clear overlap between these two ideas. And what I think about, he killed his brother, you know, in some ways, right? You can look at this as like a dark lord sort of figure or whatever, an adversarial sort of figure. That the beast system that people talk about, I think has more to do with quantity than anything else. It's not necessarily currency and money, you know, and the root of evil being the love of money. It has to do with the quantity, the reign of quantity in modern times. To me, that feels very much like the beast system. And in my opinion, too, or just an observation, I guess, it's so interesting to me. But you know who Mr. Beast is on YouTube, right?
Oh, Lord.
Mr.
Well, you know,
Beast.
the word Cain, by the way, to just give a few weaves on top of that,
please.
Kaf Yod Nun is how they spell Cain. But in philology, it's pretty permissible to like drop vowels and consider things from just the consonant connection. So you have, first of all, I already brought up, but Cohen, Ken, King, these are all phonetic matches to the idea of Cain.
Is coin another one, you think?
Coin, absolutely. That's exactly. That's why the coinage has the king on it, and is also got it is controlled by a priesthood who does the coining of the things. Now, on top of that, in Hebrew, there's a word kana, which is basically like to own or possess or to acquire. So there's like this possessive aspect of Cain. He's also like he teaches the people the arts of metallurgy as well. So that's where coinage comes from.
Yep.
And in particular, he has a descendant that really disseminates this knowledge called Tubal Cain. But in if you just drop the word two, Bal Cain, and then you understand that the Vav and the Bet are interchangeable, just like in Greek, which the Hebrew language, in my opinion, is a encoding of ancient Greek. It's not older, but that's separate. The like the Greek beta is, they say V, even though it looks like the letter B. The V and B interchangeability is one of the primary philological letter swaps. So drop the two, which could be do as well with T to D, like God, and you have Balkan or Vulcan. Vulcan. It's the same guy.
There you go.
It's
Perfect.
the same symbolism.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, exactly right. Metallurgy came up a lot when I was researching the devil card recently as well, for what it's worth, and that there's a whole correspondence with that. And even Guenon talks about that briefly, right? Very, very earthy, you know. And so what was I going to say regarding Cain? Oh, Mr. Beast, right? You watch a Mr. Beast video and kind of like how everything is everything is all quantitative. And so everything is all about numbers, the actual like prize winnings. It's all
You
about
get a ton of contestants at once, right?
Oh yeah, exactly. 2,000 contestants, $5 million, doing this. Everything is completely numbers based. He released a new series, and I was curious, and I wanted to watch it, and it's on Amazon. And I could not believe, while reading this book and thinking about all of these things and seeing how he presents everything, it is like quintessential reign of quantity, like to the next level extreme now. Because we're talking about the YouTube generation and the amount of editing, and it's all quantity over quality, so rapid edits, more contestants, just everything about it is just an onslaught of information.
So Owen Benjamin a couple years back did like a deep dive on Mr. Beast on his live stream, trying to figure out like where this guy came from and what's his deal, because he's so evidently creepy and evil. And in a nutshell, without going into too big of a tangent here, it does seem really apparent that this guy intentionally opened himself up to the lower forces, you could say. In a magical sense.
Wow.
And like his early videos, like there was one of his early videos that had to do with him spending 24 hours chanting another famous YouTuber's name.
Oh yeah.
Just for literally 24 hours, like a maniac. And then like basically later was able to gain a bunch of fame off of that other YouTuber.
Yeah.
Because of doing this.
PewDiePie.
So that's what I'm talking about. And that's what Guenon's talking about in terms of the, where he gets into his critiques of modern occultism and magic, opening people up to the lower forces. And while I don't necessarily agree that things like psychoanalysis are intrinsically dangerous in that respect, I think in the hands of the wrong practitioner, they can be.
Sure.
But I think he leaves a little bit at the door when it comes to the, rectification of one's essential quality in its proper place above their substantive quality. That some psychosomatic connection needs to be considered, and that there has to be like the healing of the body has to come by way of the mind, but that both have to happen as part of the expression of one's authentic wholeness and the proper internal unity, as opposed to the uniformity of individuation. So that's a lot, but man.
It is. Okay, it's my turn now. So I will be right back if you want to keep it going, or if you want to bring Slick. I'm sure he has opinions about all of this stuff. Not sure if he's still available, but just one moment.
Well, he's okay, sure. And Slick was saying that he's got a bad internet connection right now. I kind of did want to bring him in for a couple weaves on this subject, but if you guys go to the Vibrant call-in line, I'm sure that he's going to drop a voice message there to explain a lot of his awesome graphics here. I mean, I'm sure he's got a lot to relate to the Enneagram about this subject. I don't see the voice message unless you sent it to me directly, Gabriel. Is that true? Is that what you did? Did you send it to me personally? And yeah, it's not coming through, buddy. But we'll link the call-in line here. I haven't really been using it that much of late, but it is still a thing. Here it is in the chat. But we're at the 2-hour point, and I think that we've done a great job exhausting this topic in terms of how a live stream is capable of doing that. Suffice to say, the book itself, at least the first 25 of the 40 chapters, are going to be really helpful to somebody to help shift their worldview from the quantitative to the qualitative. And also, at the end of the day, despite some of the pessimism regarding other occult or spiritual paths of the modern age, there is an aspect of this where the end of the world, as this age's end is described, is not something to be feared, because all it actually is the end of an illusion. Not that the material world is an illusion, but the imbalance between our temporal and spatial selves, you could say, is the illusion. And that like our
enslavement to this compressing chronos aspect of time. It never really was. It's all, it's all in your head, man. Like all this is just in your head. And so, and you think about it that way, this is just like a fun dream story that we're in. Like life is but a dream. That's not something to be concerned about. It's a leap of faith. You can have the level of quality of life that you want. If you're basing your concept of quality on the quantitative accumulation of material or currency or possession in a sort of Cain-like sense, then you will probably be frustrated because those elements are governed by lower forces that want to bring a uniformity to everyone who falls under that jurisdiction. And that uniformity, as something we weren't really able to flesh out as well as Guenon does, is a reductive uniformity, not just in the scientific reductionism sense or the rationalism of philosophy in the modern age, which, by the way, rational and ratio is the same idea as quantitative, distinct, integer, separative. That's why quantity is separative in nature. My point being, if you are under the jurisdiction of this quantitative idea that you think your quality of life is based on that, then you'll be disappointed. And I think the greatest example of that is like this lowest common denominator aspect is through education, that the No Child Left Behind, the Common Core curriculum, all these things serve to rather than bring people up to an elevated level of whatever this type of uniformity is applied to. All it is really capable of doing is bringing people to a lowest common denominator. Communism, case in point. Communism had this promise of the workers' utopia and that, resources and wealth would be equally distributed and there would be this quantitative uniformity for everyone, and everyone starved. There was not enough. So that's the lack aspect of the quantitative life. But if your aspiration to quality in your life is related to the discovery of the discovery and bringing forth of the intrinsic essential quality of your soul, then you will experience abundance in the forms in which are compatible with your soul. And even those ways in which you feel lack are the teachers and the purifying fires that help you remove the false expectations that you had on what you thought quality was. So it's a leap of faith, but like quality is definitely not the same as quantity. Like I'm not rich in my bank account, but I don't lack for anything. I'm able to eat quality food. I have a quality of life that is measured in love and measured in novelty and measured in exploration and wisdom. And that's something like I want everyone to have that wants it. I think some people maybe don't even want to go there, but that's not who we're talking to tonight.
Right.
Anyway, that's my rant.
No, here. Man, honestly, I feel like you were the perfect person to talk about this with, just with your background and just like what you've been saying lately too. I'm glad we were able to come together, and you've helped me understand this material better as well. And I kind of want to ask you a little bit about being a father now and the quality versus quantity dynamic. I can't help but think, obviously, that you have been talking more about quality over quantity since becoming a father, right? So that sort of transformation, and that makes all the sense in the world that would happen that way.
Sure. I'm glad you asked that. And thanks for the kind words there. I feel the same way about you. Like the fact that I even looked at this book now is because of your suggestion. I think maybe I would have gotten to it because Guenon has become something I'm interested in of late. But
sure.
Yeah, I feel like this was meant to be for me at this time, especially. And this conversation helped me get my head around the epiphanies even better. Thank you for that. But becoming a father, right? One of the reasons why people avoid having children is because there's this belief that they're not going to have enough money or that they're not going to have enough time for themselves or what have you. And I admit that going into having a baby, I had this idea that maybe there was going to be like a compression of the possibilities of me doing the things that I needed to do or wanted to do. And don't get me wrong, I'm only 3 months in, and a lot can change about like what the demands of fatherhood will be, as most of the childcare falls upon the mother at this age. But that being said, I've actually found a profound expansion in my ability to create and to engage in the things that I feel are important since the baby has come. I mean, a massive qualitative increase in my work and in my intention towards my work. And I've not felt any sort of lack in terms of having time to do it all. You know, I mean, like to get through this book in time for this stream was a little tough because I read another book for an interview that I thought was going to be tomorrow that I sort of prioritized, but then that got moved. But that being said, I've discovered that the iPhone allows you to read text off of a screen. So if you're looking at old PDFs that have that are free to download, you can get your phone to read it to you in a pretty decent Siri voice.
Nice.
And that will help fill the gaps when you need to do something else but keep the information flowing. So anyway, there's always a way. Yeah. I've not felt any lack of time. Hopefully Jennifer feels the same way. That her time is not too compressed. I think it's a little more demanding on her, but for sure, you know, the real quantitative improvement of humanity is having more humans, despite what they tell us about the idea that there's too many of us and that that's causing a problem. The qualities of this essential unity of the center are more entirely expressed by the human being than any other phenomenon of the reality. And so to believe that there's too many of us, we're a parasite, we're a plague on the planet, we're destroying the environment, we shouldn't reproduce is, you know, the opposite of the truth. And bring in more of this life into the world is what allows for the quality of the world to be improved. Every good thing that ever changed in the world was because of the human spirit. Everything else in nature is in a sort of eternal sameness, despite what you're told about evolution. You know, nature is more of a static playground. We're the agents of change. That's my opinion.
Gotcha. Beautiful. No, I've noticed a difference, to be honest with you. It's really small sort of stuff, but I think you're trending in the right direction with things. And I was curious to see if I would see any sort of difference with your output or with the channel or anything like that. And there has been, but it's on the positive end. And so, anyway, so kudos and keep on doing your thing, man, that way. And yeah, can't wait to see what else you do with this sort of new framework that you have going on.
Thanks, man. I feel like I'm just at the beginning of it, but to put that at the priority is it's like a great demonstration of how your belief system changes your reality. And the fact that we're running this quantity is more important than quality thing is subconscious for most of us. So to intentionally shift it and focus on it is it does have a ripple effect that I think will resonate beyond this moment and go further. So thanks for all that. And I look forward to the next time we get to do this, whatever point down the road, near or far, that you think of a topic that you'd like to mix it up with me about, or that you'd like to bring me over for a conversation about. I'd love to. You know, there's nobody else like you in the world, Mario.
Beautiful. Right on. Thanks, man. No, maybe one last thing I want to say is just being present and how that really can change your perspective on things, trending towards quality over quantity. And just noticing how many people are constantly thinking about the future and constantly anxious and constantly projecting or constantly wishing things were different or that they had made a different decision or something along those lines, right? But really being present and can make such a huge difference with your quality of life, and also not rushing to do this, rushing to do that, you know. And so it's just something, it's really practical, it's really basic and simple or whatever. But it's these little things, these little changes that you can make that'll kind of open up the abundance of the quality over quantity sort of dynamic. So just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, delete the idea that you're busy.
Right.
the word busy is funny that that's put in front of the term that we use for conducting business, right? But
Right.
being busy is super antithetical to life. You know, you put out the aura of I'm busy, and the invitations to life and novelty
Mhm.
are dramatically throttled.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
people are like, I was going to ask you to do this, but I figured you were busy. I'm just like, how dare you? Never call me busy again.
Right. Gotcha. No, I know you get it. So, right on.
Okay, well, we'll catch everybody later. Thanks for tuning in. Learn more about biofield tuning with me at innerversepodcast.com/sound-healing. And catch you guys on the flip. Got another episode coming sometime this week. I think I'll drop it Sunday, discussing the Italian Hermetic tradition of the early 20th century and the fascinating life and writings of Marco Daffy, with the author of a recent book about alchemical hermeticism. So look forward to that. And then there's an Inner World coming the week after that. We've already recorded with Crow 777 alongside me and Dylan. So we got a lot of good stuff coming down the pike, including another Vibrant next week on Wednesday. So hopefully we'll have quality and quantity.
Right.
All right. Good night, everybody.
See you guys.